Politics and football. There are two topics that many say shouldn't mix. If you read a newspaper, one section is in the front, the other in the back. But this is 2020, and it hasn't been so easy to separate the two.
I think that everybody needs to play their part in this national effort, and that means Premier League footballers too.
Why are you being told as MPs by the Conservative whips to gang up against Marcus Rashford?
The FA chairman, Greg Clark, who replaced Greg Dyke in 2017, made a series of gaffes at a parliamentary hearing today, as you say.
As much as we try to deny it, they are linked. And today's story is no different. Last year, on October 1st, the UK's Home Secretary, Priti Patel, addressed hundreds of Tories at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. But she might as well have been standing at the halfway line addressing thousands at Old Trafford, Anfield, or Stamford Bridge.
And as Home Secretary, at this defining moment in our country's history, I have a particular responsibility when it comes to taking back control. It is to end the free movement of people once and for all. Instead, we will introduce an Australian-style points-based immigration system.
Fast forward to this month, and English football has its own immigration point-based system. Due to Brexit, freedom of movement with European players has officially ended. As a result, the Football Association and the Premier League have been forced to agree on new rules regarding non-homegrown players. It is one of the biggest reforms to the English transfer system in years. Today, we break down the new point system and ask, what does it mean for English football?
It's big. Brexit has caused lots of headaches for everyone, and football's no different.
Mike Keegan is a sports news correspondent for the Daily Mail.
You know, it was pretty simple, like it was for the rest of us, really. When you think about travelling on holiday in Europe, you don't really have to think twice about it because you just breeze through it, passport control, and it's, you know, we're all part of the EU, and that was the same for the system with the Premier League. You know, EU countries, that was fine, you didn't really have to worry about it. So now it's pretty much everybody who is coming in from overseas will be subject to a points-based system. So it just means that clubs really have to think about who they're going for, whether they will hit that points criteria. They've introduced a governing body entry system. It's kind of like a calculator. So the clubs can log on there, and when they're thinking about a transfer target, somebody they want to bring over, and they can calculate how many points they would get. So it's like a lot of things with Brexit, things have become incredibly complicated.
You reported that there was a vote recently between the Premier League. You know, what were the results of that vote, and what was kind of the split in terms of this agreement?
So the Premier League wrote to the clubs last week, and fortunately I managed to catch sight of that email, and basically they outlined what the initial agreement was. Like anything in the Premier League, it needs to get at least 14 clubs on board out of the 20. A little bit different circumstances this time. Usually they would have a meeting and then they would all vote on it and we would know who voted for what. This time I think probably for speed of process, because obviously there's a lot of things going on with the pandemic outside of this. Clubs were asked for their feedback and then to vote via email. So what I know is that obviously the Premier League were like, look, guys, time is kind of ticking on this. The government needs an answer from us. The transfer window is around the corner. They need the time to put this through. So I think they heavily recommended that this be accepted with the caveat that in February they can review it. So 19 clubs voted in favour with one against. I know you're going to ask me who the one against. Under normal circumstances, I would be able to tell you, but because this was all done in private, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the one club that did vote against, a lot of work went into trying to bring them around, because it's always better for the Premier League to put on a unified front. You know, we all wanted this. And there's, with one voting against, there's a suggestion that it isn't unanimous. So 19 to 1 is obviously more than enough. They'd have liked 20, but I think there is an acceptance that, we need to come to a conclusion, and this is not as bad as it could have been.
And so then from here, this goes to the Home Office for approval. As it's kind of obvious, this is an immigration first and foremost. Is there any chance that, they don't accept this? Obviously, you're not an immigration expert, but...
there's always a chance, but I would be absolutely amazed. Reading between the lines, the immigration office is like, we are overwhelmed with Brexit. We have lots and lots of things to focus on. Football is obviously a huge bringer of income for our economy. So it's like, guys, get on with it. We'll go with the governing body entry system. You figure this out between yourselves and then come back to us with a plan and we'll rubber stamp it. So these people at the FA and the Premier League aren't stupid. They're not going to come up with something that will have no chance of getting through. I think there is a belief at the Home Office that we'll cut them a little bit of slack. If they're both in agreement, then we're quite happy to proceed. So I know for a fact that the feeling within football is that this should not have any problems with the Home Office.
Before we kind of get to the details of this agreement, how long have these sides been negotiating or discussing this deal?
2 years. It's been a long, drawn-out battle, really. One thing, when you speak to the comms guys, and it's obviously, that's their job and they're there to protect the image of both the Premier League and the FA, and they've always been very keen to kind of put out this picture of, we're having a grown-up adult debate about this and we're both working towards a solution. Now, it got pretty feisty at times. The issue for the Premier League is that they're representing 20 different clubs, 20 different agendas, and it's kind of the one thing that every Premier League club has in common is self-interest. So I do have a lot of sympathy for the Premier League because they're trying to, the interests of, say, a Manchester City or a Liverpool or a Chelsea would be different than, say, a Burnley or a Sheffield United. So it was never going to be smooth. And there were times where it get quite feisty. I do the sports agenda column at the Mail, and I did a piece in there about Les Reed, who was obviously on the FA's side in this, and an interview that was brought to my attention that he'd done before he was at the FA whilst he was at Southampton, in which he'd said that quotas were not a good idea. And yet here he is arguing for quotas. So it's been a really interesting one. It's been a long, drawn-out battle. And I think the fact that it has taken this long to come to a conclusion, we really are in the last minute of extra time here. So I think that shows you how much at odds the two sides have been.
So let's kind of dig into this agreement. You mentioned in your report last week, the 15 points. Can you kind of detail what is this 15-point system?
We could be sat here for 4 hours talking about the ins and outs and the various criteria. I think the simple way of doing it is there's how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Probably 7 key points on this. So if you split that into 4 sections, so the first one will be international appearances. So they will look at, first and foremost, senior international appearances, youth international appearances. And those nations are obviously ranked by FIFA, so that makes it quite easy. So for nations 1 to 50, the FA can give what is being called an auto pass. So it's like, look, if you are playing regularly, and I think this was, I might trip myself up here, but I'm pretty sure it was around 79% or more of minutes for these countries. If they're in the top 1 to 50, you get what's called an auto pass, and you just straight through the points. Points is irrelevant. So there's international appearances is the first part of the criteria. Then it's quality of club. So they're looking at the quality of the league that the club that's selling the player is in, the position of that club in the league, and any continental progression that they've had in recent times. Then it goes to club appearances. So that's minutes in domestic league and minutes in continental competition. And then that's where the points come from. So you add all those kinds of things together, and that gives you a points total. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting is that there is an exception panel, which will basically look at exceptional circumstances. So if the player that you want to sign finishes on 12, 13 or 14 points, that's not a no. You can then take that to the exception panel and say, present your case and say, look, we didn't hit the 15 points, but we really do think that this player will come and add something to our club and to the league itself. and we want you to give him the green light to come in and play for us. For me, that's fascinating because we've not really had that system before. I know there have been appeals and the Carlos Tevez situation, etc., but I think that's got potential for some great arguments because we know what Premier League clubs are like, and it's like, hang on a minute, you got this guy in, and yet the exceptions panel is telling us we can't get this guy in. So I think as a journalist, that might serve us quite well over the coming months.
Just to go further on that, I mean, do we know, I know it's quite early, who would possibly be on that panel?
I asked the question in the FA, and the answer I got was a little bit sketchy. I think the suggestion is that would be the FA themselves. So that is something I'm going to go back and look at and see if that is the case, because it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's, if we want somebody from the Premier League, then do they then have affiliation to any of the clubs? Is there an argument, this guy loves Liverpool or he loves Man United and he's letting all their players in and he's not letting any of ours in? So that's quite an important question. From what I can recall, the FA said that would be themselves that were on the panel. So yeah, it's a fascinating element of all this.
Now, you mentioned in your piece that the plan includes an additional 3 points for, quote, top flight sides. Can you give some examples of the 66 clubs that classify as top flight sides? Are these just European clubs?
Yeah, so it's a global thing, and I've got the sheet in front of me now, and it is, anyone that you would imagine as a top side is on there. So, it starts with Real Madrid, Barcelona, PSG. And in Spain, you're looking at the likes of Valencia, Real Sociedad, Athletic Bilbao. For me, it was interesting on the English front. So if you're signing a player from another English club who is from overseas, I think I named them in the story. It was United, Arsenal, Chelsea, City, Southampton, Spurs, Liverpool. And that was it. So not exactly a ringing endorsement for all the academies in the Premier League. There were some interesting ones. I mean, some of the ones that you might not think. So Vigo in Spain, were one, Osasuna were another. So it's a great insight into where the Premier League clubs at least think the best young players are coming from. Traditional names from South America, so River Plate from Argentina. Along with the traditional names, you've got Boca Juniors, Newell's, Sao Paulo, Santos, Independiente, Corinthians, but then the likes of Colo-Colo, Chile, Penarol, Uruguay, Olimpia, Paraguay, Atletico Nacional, Colombia. So clearly this is the battleground, shall we say, from the market that the Premier League will scour the most. It does look to me as though it should now be easier for Premier League clubs to get talent from South America. And I think that's one of the victories for the Premier League in this.
Interesting. So it'll be obviously a little bit more difficult to get European players, but easier to get South American players.
Yeah, that's one of the things that the Premier League could take from that. Because in times gone by, if you wanted to sign a kid from South America, you would have your work cut out for them if they weren't making international appearances. And that's why you see, the likes of clubs in Spain and Portugal absolutely hoovering up that talent.
Just to go on what you said before, so if we're looking at a smaller side, let's say in Germany, we're looking at like a Wolfsburg or a Werder Bremen or Hertha Berlin, or we're looking at a smaller club in, Italy, maybe even a second division Italian club. Are those players going to, find it really difficult to get into the Premier League now?
Yeah, pretty much. And that would be it. So the clubs that you listed, I was just looking through the list, and none of those that you mentioned from glimpsing at it now are on the list. So I suppose you'd say the argument and the FA's argument with that would be, well, are those players coming in and enhancing the quality of the league, the whole best versus best principle, or are they coming in because they're cheap and they are robbing English players of a chance, and English players who you'd make a case that are equally as talented as them?
So just to be clear, one of the things with the old work permits for non-EU players, there was a lot of importance placed on a transfer fee. Just to be clear, a transfer fee is not one of the criteria that's used in this new system.
Well, there's about 14 pages of criteria. The key components that have been set out to the clubs, there is no mention of transfer fee in there. So I can't say that because I've not seen everything, but it's certainly not one of the key elements that's been relayed to the clubs.
Now, something else that's interesting about this is the U21 internationals. In the past, teams were allowed to stockpile as many young players as they wanted, and that was seemingly unlimited. It seems like that's not the case now. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think in the first instance for the forthcoming window, they've agreed to cap it at 3, and I think then it's gone to 6. A lot of this, initially the row was over the number of overseas players permitted in a first team squad, and I think the FA went to try and bring that down from, I think it was 17 to 13. That was never going to be the case, but I don't think they were ever going to win that battle. So it kind of then shifted to young players and the under-21 system. So 3 in the first instance in the January window. The fear from the FA, look, it's quite clear. They don't want to see the Premier League's academies flooded with young players from overseas. So in the first window, I think they've capped it at 3, and I think they've then said 6. All of this is subject to review, but I know that I think the FA are quite happy with the way that this is concluded.
You mentioned that this is all subject to review. They're going to review this in February, and then it seems like after every window. What do you take away from that? What does that tell you if you read between the lines?
The noise from inside the FA on this review is that it's probably not going to change much. The noise from within the Premier League, we have reassured our clubs that if January comes and is a disaster, or we're having problems with this, we don't like the way it's going, then we'll review it in February. So the Premier League seems to be a lot stronger on that than the FA. So if you go to somebody at the FA, they'll probably tell you, yeah, the review is just kind of like a little safeguard mechanism, but it's nothing much is going to change. If you go to somebody at the Premier League, they might have a different view on that and say, look, this is just an initial framework. We had to reach some kind of agreement because the clock was ticking. And we do have the chance to amend that. But look, the overriding thing is that this is called a governing body entry system for a reason. It's the governing body that gets the call on this. So I would probably fall down on the FA side of that one.
Obviously, this is still early days and we haven't really seen it put into practice yet. So this is a huge grain of salt. But who would you say got the better end of the deal and why?
It's a perfect politician's solution. So there's enough in that agreement for both sides to come out and say, we got, things that we wanted. For me, and it is a little bit simplistic, the Premier League, I was told, wanted the points barrier to be set at 9. The FA wanted that at 18. So, look, basic maths would tell you 15 is closer to 18 than 9. That said, the way that those points are calculated, there's a lot of discussion over. So the Premier League did get some admissions in their favour on that. I honestly don't think we'll see that much change with regards to the standard of the Premier League and also with regards to the number of players coming forward for the England squad. So, but as I said at the start of the answer, both sides can come away from this feeling that they've done quite well. But I think the FA are probably more happier with this than the Premier League.
If we zoom out a little bit, what do you think are the big consequences of this? What are the big takeaways we should be taking from this new agreement?
I think the whole process has given us a bit of an insight into the way that the Premier League work and the way that they identify talent. For me, the list of 66 was fascinating. The Premier League is obviously adamant that the reason it is so successful is this whole best concept of best versus best, and that needs to stay at all costs. And there are valid points about English talent coming through. So they would point to City and Chelsea and the England squads that we're seeing at the moment with a lot of younger talent. This shows us a landscape, right, of where we are at the moment and what both sides want. And I think it shone a light really on that. And as I said, I don't think we'll see huge changes. I think the Premier League will retain its standard. And I think that the situation with England will remain the same. It will just be interesting to see what impact this has with regards to the kind of value they place on those English players and the efforts that are made to stop them from going abroad.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. But to get another perspective and analyze what it means for football in England, I spoke to Tim Wigmore. Wigmore is a sports journalist for The Telegraph and author of the recent book, The Best: How Elite Athletes Are Made. So Tim, if we zoom out, how does this new point system compare to the previous system? Kind of what are the biggest similarities and what are the biggest differences?
So the most obvious and a big difference is that now all foreign players are treated in exactly the same way. So before Brexit, players from Europe and players from outside Europe were treated completely different ways. There's no work permit restrictions on players from Europe. So any club could sign anyone as long as they didn't go over the limit of 17 overseas players in their 25-man squad. One of the really big changes is there's now a limit on non-homegrown under 21 players. So at the moment, you can sign as many European players under 21 as you like, and they do not count to your 25-man squad in the Premier League. Now that will change, and you'll only have basically a limit of 17 overseas players regardless of their age. So that's a really big change. There's this new 15-point system, which is pretty complicated in terms of the eligibility for players, and it does treat players differently under 21 versus older. It still creates a pathway for very good young players who maybe haven't become regulars at leading clubs. So that's a really big shift. The work permit rules now probably did something that should have happened a generation ago, was that they recognise the kind of primacy of club football. And by that, I mean the previous rules, whether a player could get work permit was really linked massively to the ranking of their international team. But obviously, as we know, actually international football, you could have one of the best players in the world just happen to not be from a leading country. And so this led to Crystal Palace were unable to sign Alphonso Davies a few years ago. And we all know what a fantastic kind of journey he's been on since then.
Here he comes, 19 years of age, from Vancouver to Champions League winner. Congratulations, Alphonso Davies.
So actually, that makes quite a lot of sense. That sort of barrier for very good players from less established countries has been lowered now.
So who do you think are some of the biggest winners and losers in this agreement? And that could just not be the FA and the different clubs, but, clubs within the league itself, big clubs, small clubs as well.
Yeah, so to kind of zoom out, I think for the FA, this is broadly a pretty good deal in that it should mean there's more opportunities for young English players and so on. Although for the Premier League, they were very keen that the number of mandatory homegrown players did not increase from 8 out of 25. But overall, I think the FA has probably got more of what it set out to do than the Premier League has. In terms of sort of the winners and losers from the point of view of clubs, well, I think the work permit rules as they are creates the risk that it's easier for leading clubs to sign the players that they want, as their players generally will be more expensive and better, so more likely to tick enough of those boxes to get work permits in place. And I think there is somewhat of a risk that this makes it harder for mid-table clubs to benefit from good scouting systems. And obviously, people think of Leicester City's story, also a club like Brighton has kind of scouted the continent extremely well and signed some very good players for cheap. I think some of those transfers might now be harder. So I think there probably is a risk that this will be bad for the competitive balance of the Premier League.
Can we go in a little bit more detail into that? You mentioned Leicester. We just did an episode about Leicester, and in it we mentioned their scouting. Can you be a bit more specific on how a team like that will be affected and maybe find it harder to get some of these cheaper players from less popular countries?
So the new criteria, essentially, there'll be a combination of factors such as everything from the player's club, how regularly the player is played. There'll still be some weight given to a player's nationality, but basically it's a sort of ranking of the pedigree of a player, and therefore players with a lot of pedigree who are more likely to be more expensive and go to the bigger clubs, they're unlikely to be affected by those rules, whereas players a bit more under the radar are more likely to not tick enough of those boxes. And I know that research has been done basically looking at how European players previously, how many of them would have been eligible had they been treated as non-European players on the Premier League's previous work permit rules. And basically half of European players who signed in Premier League history would not have been eligible. That would not be quite as extreme as that in terms of who's not able to join now because the work permit rules. I think it will get a little bit harder for clubs to actually, even if they identify undervalued players, to actually be able to bring them into the league.
Yeah, so some of those diamonds in the rough might be a little bit harder to get. Who are some players that have been previously denied work permits that might pass this new criteria, and maybe vice versa, players that did used to get work permits and wouldn't get one now?
So players who wouldn't get one now, the most obvious group is actually European players who signed at age 16 and 17, because FIFA says you cannot have an international transfer for under 18 players unless they're transferring between two countries in the EEA, the European Economic Area. So players such as Cesc Fabregas, Paul Pogba when he first joined Man United, Hector Bellerin, they would not have been eligible to sign for Premier League clubs at the time that they did because they were under 18. Also a series of other European players would not have been eligible. Potentially guys like Riyad Mahrez and N'Golo Conte might not have been eligible. In terms of who would be eligible, it's a much smaller group by definition. The only real group of players who now find it easy to join are young players from outside of Europe. So actually when Douglas Luiz signed for Manchester City before joining Aston Villa, he was not eligible to sign, so he had to basically go on loan for a year. Someone like him would now be able to join City without having that loan period. But overall, clearly, there are a lot more players now attractive to Premier League clubs who would not be able to join than players who previously wouldn't have been able to join and now can.
So it seems like one of the byproducts of this is that a group of kind of elite South American clubs might be the biggest winner in all this in an indirect way, because they have access now kind of to the richest market in football that maybe they didn't have before, and that we might see more South American players in the Premier League. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we certainly should see more South American players in the Premier League, especially more young South American players. But probably shouldn't kind of exaggerate this. There's already a kind of very clear pathway to Portugal as a kind of gateway to Europe for South American players, which a lot of players use. It might be that now some can kind of join the Premier League early without having that step. But actually, Premier League clubs generally are signing somewhat fewer players from countries like Argentina than a few years ago, and more actually from Europe. So yes, I think we will see more South American players. I don't think it will be maybe quite as big an influx as some have kind of implied.
One of the main issues of this new agreement is obviously how it will impact English players here in England. How do you think this agreement will impact youth development in the country?
I think the first thing to say, which is really important, and the Premier League has been saying this, but that's fair enough because it's true, is that it has been a very good few years for young talent in England. Probably go back to Egypt Triple P, created in 2012, and we've seen a real increase in the quality of English players. We've also seen an actual increase in minutes of English players in the Premier League. So in 2018-19, there was a rise of 5% of the proportion of games started by England qualified players to 35%. We've obviously seen the national team, its fortunes have got better. England's youth teams have become a lot more successful in recent years. So English youth development is actually in a pretty good place at the moment. I think it shouldn't undermine that and might help certain types of players get more opportunities, but the flip side of that is if they're playing in slightly lower quality games, the players they're playing with at training are slightly less good, whether that actually stunts their development a little bit. overall, I think England youth development will continue on its path. I don't see this as being a kind of radical shift. In a funny way, actually, what this does do, it kind of ensures that Premier League clubs will have to continue to focus on English talent, because one of the key bits of the new work permit changes agreed between the Premier League and the FA is that they will be reviewed after every transfer window. And the kind of understanding is that if the minutes of England players decreases, and probably that the national team becomes less successful, and there's worries about the quality of players that are coming through the system, then there's a possibility then that minimum of 8 homegrown players would then be increased a little bit further down the line. So actually that's the stick for Premier League clubs, that if they aren't able to show that England continue to produce a lot of good young players, that's when there's a possibility that the FA will increase that number from 8 to 10 or 12 or something, which the Premier League has been so keen to resist throughout these negotiations.
As you mentioned, it kind of comes down to this, opportunity in terms of English players getting more opportunity in academies, since there will, in theory, be less foreign talent to compete with, but at the same time, potentially playing against inferior competition because you don't have that maybe better foreign talent that's imported. As someone who's kind of studied youth development, what do you think is more important for youth players, more opportunity or better competition?
Well, if you look in general, very simply, the most successful countries in Europe, they tend to have leagues that are stronger, and in those stronger leagues, it's actually harder for their young players to play compared to if you're a kid in Latvia, you easier to play than a kid in England or Germany, but that doesn't mean that the national team is better in Latvia. So that shows that competition is really important as a driver, because it obviously provides opportunity for players to learn from teammates and rivals, and it's a push on them to improve because they have to improve to get in the team. But that said, minutes are important as well, so it's a balance.
But the final area that this might impact, which hasn't really been looked at much, is on the football league, on the EFL. There are a number of Europeans based in the championship, and they've gotten a lot of talent from Europe recently. Do you think that the EFL will be hit hard by these new rules?
I think the EFL is looking like it will become a league in which English players play a high proportion of minutes, and it is harder for those clubs to identify players from abroad and be able to sign them. Obviously, it's somewhat easier to sign players under 21 from abroad. The rules are a bit slacker now than over 21, so you might see more championship clubs trying to almost sell themselves as a gateway to the Premier League. And so because those work permit rules are a little bit looser for young players from abroad, they might try and join clubs in the championship, and clubs in the championship might actually be really keen to sign them, because actually it will be easier as a young foreign player to sign for an English club age 20 than age 22 or 23. So you might get championship clubs try and position themselves as, right, if you come here, play for a few years, try and help us get to the Premier League. But if you don't manage to do that, then you'll still impress and get yourself a contract with a Premier League club. So we might see the kind of age profile of the types of foreign players signed by championship clubs trend downwards, I think.
So is there anything else that we didn't mention that, it might be an unintended consequence of this?
Yeah, I think one weird thing we're going to see is a big rise in the number of English goalkeepers in the Premier League. And that's basically because for less established goalkeepers from overseas, a lot who now might be second choice keepers for clubs, lots of those they will not tick enough of those boxes to get work permits. And because Premier League clubs will not be able to kind of sign young overseas goalkeepers and use those not as part of their 17 overseas players, I think we'll see clubs thinking, well, second and third choice goalkeepers don't really play a huge amount. We might suddenly have 40 English goalkeepers in the Premier League, and it might be, if you're a young kid and you're equally good at goalkeeper and centre half, then actually, and you want to play in the Premier League, the kind of smart thing to do is to become a goalkeeper, because we'll see more vacancies for English keepers in the Premier League.
If we fast forward 2 or 3 years, or maybe even 5 or 10 years, how big an impact will this have on football in England, and how so?
So, I mean, The quality of the Premier League will be damaged by this. This is not a good outcome for the Premier League overall. We'll see somewhat more of the world's best footballers probably not playing in England now. It will be more difficult for Premier League clubs to kind of use their scouting network at an earlier age and identify players, so they therefore find themselves a few years down the line having to pay, a lot more of a premium for players. So from the kind of the cost balance perspective for Premier League clubs, it will be bad. So this is it will be a good outcome for the rest of the big five, probably, head to head with Premier League teams in the Champions League and so on. That will damage the Premier League standing and just the kind of quality of the Premier League. But I don't think it's going to be a catastrophic impact. I think we'll see the quality of the Premier League kind of eroded around the edges. We might see the competitive balance of the league becoming somewhat worse. We'll see the dynamics of what type of overseas players join the Premier League being different. And of course, one of those more positive outcomes for the Premier League would be actually that if it becomes more globalised in terms of the countries that are represented in the league, that actually helps to grow its appeal, in countries outside of Europe. So that's a potential opportunity for the Premier League. None of this is good news for the Premier League, but I don't think it's a disaster. It's not going to knock the Premier League back massively around the world, but it will pose challenges for the Premier League.
Mike Keegan is a sports news correspondent for the Daily Mail and is the editor of the Sports Agenda column. Tim Wigmore is a sports journalist for The Telegraph and author of the recent book, The Best: How Elite Athletes Are Made. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, why not sign up to our Patreon page, where you'll get access to full interviews, bonus episodes, and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.